This is a disturbing Christianity iceberg. Tier 1. The Massacre of Jerusalem. Imagine you are a civilian in Jerusalem in 1099, hiding inside a mosque because the city walls have been breached. Outside, you hear the clash of steel and men shouting in a language you don't understand. Then, the doors burst open and armed soldiers rush inside. 4 years earlier, in 1095, Pope Urban II stood up in France and gave a speech that changed everything. He called on Christians across Western Europe to march to the Middle East and take Jerusalem back from Muslim control. To make the offer even more appealing, he promised that anyone who joined the campaign would have all their sins forgiven. That was a powerful incentive. Thousands of knights, soldiers, and ordinary people from France, Germany, Italy, and other parts of Europe answered the call. The campaign would later come to be known as the First Crusade. The trip took almost 3 years. By the time the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in June 1099, disease, starvation, and constant fighting had already wiped out most of them. Out of the huge crowds that started the journey, only about 15,000 people were left. But they were still determined to take the city. The problem was, Jerusalem wasn't exactly sitting there unguarded waiting for them. At the time, it was controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, and the governor had been preparing for this moment. He kicked the local Christians out so they couldn't help the Crusaders, poisoned the wells outside the walls, and locked the city down. Basically, if the Crusaders wanted Jerusalem, they were going to have to earn it the hard way. They surrounded the city and laid siege to it for about 5 weeks. Then, on July 15, 1099, they finally broke through the walls. What followed turned into one of the most brutal massacres of the entire Crusades. The fighting didn't stop with the defenders. The Crusaders spread through the streets and started killing everyone they came across. Muslims who ran to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock for safety were surrounded and slaughtered inside. Women, children, and religious scholars were also killed. One account estimated that around 10,000 people died in the temple area alone. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were scattered across the streets. Some accounts say blood pooled so deep around the Temple Mount, the soldiers walked through it up to their ankles. The Jewish people of Jerusalem faced the same horror. They had actually fought alongside Muslim soldiers to defend the city, but when the walls fell, Jewish civilians ran to their main synagogue. According to the Muslim chronicler, Ibn al-Qalanisi, the Crusaders set the building on fire with the people still inside. Other accounts say the soldiers lifted their shields, surrounded the burning building, and sang hymns while the people inside screamed. Once the killing finally slowed down, the Crusaders got to work looting the city. They searched houses for valuables, but that wasn't all. Some of them started cutting open the stomachs of the dead because they believed people had swallowed gold coins to hide them. Others piled bodies into heaps and burned them, then sifted through the ashes looking for melted metal. When it was finally over, the Crusader leaders walked barefoot through the blood-soaked streets to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to pray and thank God. They described the massacre as a cleansing. One chronicler even wrote that Jerusalem had been purified from the contamination of pagan inhabitants. In their minds, this was a holy victory. The Levite's concubine. Imagine you're a woman in a strange town. A mob is outside demanding to be let in. You look to your husband for protection. Instead, he pushes you out the door to save himself, leaving you alone in the dark with people who mean you harm. That story actually comes straight from the Bible. It appears in the book of Judges, chapter 19 through 21, and it's easily one of the most disturbing episodes in the entire text. The story takes place during the period of the Judges, a time before Israel had kings or any strong central government to keep people in check. At the center of the story is a man known only as the Levite. Levites were a religious class in Israel responsible for teaching God's law and helping run worship. So on paper, this is supposed to be one of the good guys. The Levite had a concubine, essentially a secondary wife with lower status. She was from Bethlehem, and at some point she left him and returned to her father's house there. The exact reason isn't clear. Some ancient manuscripts say she was unfaithful, while others say she simply became angry and left. What we do know is that she stayed with her father in Bethlehem for about 4 months. Eventually, the Levite went to bring her back. Her father welcomed him warmly and kept convincing him to stay longer, so the visit stretched out for several days. On the 5th day, the Levite finally insisted on leaving. By the time they set out, it was already late in the afternoon, which made traveling risky. They kept going anyway, and eventually reached the town of Gibeah, which belonged to the Israelite tribe of Benjamin. The Levite assumed they would be safe among their own people. They weren't. An old man from the Levite's hometown saw them sitting in the town square and invited them into his house for the night. But while they were inside eating, a mob surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. The Bible calls them sons of wickedness. They demanded that the old man hand over the Levite so they could assault him. The old man begged them to stop, and even offered his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine instead. The mob refused and kept demanding the Levite. That's when the Levite did something shocking. Without hesitation, he grabbed his concubine and shoved her outside into the crowd. The men assaulted her all night and only let her go at dawn. Somehow, she managed to crawl back to the house and collapse at the doorway. When the Levite opened the door the next morning, he saw her lying there and simply told her to get up so they could leave. She didn't respond. She was dead. He loaded her body onto a donkey and took her home. Then he did something even more disturbing. He cut her body into 12 pieces and sent one piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel, along with a message explaining what had happened. The tribes were horrified. They gathered an army of about 400,000 men and demanded that the tribe of Benjamin hand over the attackers. Benjamin refused, and the dispute turned into a civil war. By the end of the fighting, the tribe of Benjamin was almost wiped out. Out of tens of thousands of men, only about 600 survived. And that's where the story ends. The Stedinger Crusade. In the early 1100s, a group of Dutch farmers moved to a stretch of empty marshland along the Weser River, in what is now northern Germany. The Archbishop of Bremen invited them there and offered the simple deal: drain the swamps and make the land usable, and it would be theirs. They could govern themselves, run their own assemblies, and only owed the church a small annual payment, 1 coin a year, less a share of the harvest. So the farmers got to work. They built dikes, drained the marshes, and over the next century turned worthless swamp into productive farmland. They called themselves the Stedingers, and for generations the arrangement worked just fine. Then the church decided it wanted more. By the early 1200s, the Archbishop of Bremen tried to change the deal. Instead of owning their land freely, the Stedingers would now hold it as tenants. On top of that, he demanded new taxes and forced labor that had never been part of the original agreement. The Stedingers refused. They kicked out the Archbishop's tax collectors, stopped paying anything, and declared full independence. For about 15 years, the standoff dragged on. In 1219, a new Archbishop, Gerhard II, took over Bremen and inherited a problem. He demanded the Stedingers fall in line and pay what they owed. They refused, just like before. Gerhard tried to pressure them through the church, and around 1227, he had them excommunicated, cutting them off from religious life. When that didn't work, he tried force. On Christmas Day in 1229, Gerhard personally led an army into Stedinger territory, but the farmers knew the marshland better than anyone. They fought back, defeated his troops, and even killed Gerhard's own brother in the process. After that humiliation, Gerhard changed tactics. In 1230, he called the church council in Bremen and had the Stedingers declared heretics. Some accusations were real, like attacking priests and burning churches during the rebellion. But the council also added charges that had nothing to do with reality, claiming the Stedingers worshipped wax figures, talked to evil spirits, and did things too terrible to describe. Historians today agree those charges were fabricated, but in the 1200s, labeling someone a heretic had serious consequences. It meant the Pope could authorize a crusade against them, and that's exactly what happened. In October 1232, Pope Gregory IX officially called a crusade against the Stedingers. The accusations kept getting worse, now including demon worship and satanic rituals. Preachers spread the call to arms across the region, and the Pope promised the same spiritual reward for fighting these farmers as he did for fighting in the Holy Land. The first attack in 1233 failed because the Stedingers used their marshland to defend themselves. But in May 1234, a much larger army marched in, led by the Duke of Brabant, along with counts from Holland, Gelders, and other territories. They crossed into Stedinger land on a bridge made of boats. The farmers mostly had pikes and short swords. The Crusaders had armored knights. The battle at Altenesch on May 27 turned into a slaughter. Estimates say anywhere from 2,000 to 11,000 people were killed, and the records mention women and children among the dead. Afterward, the Pope lifted excommunication on the survivors. Their land was confiscated and divided between the Archbishop of Bremen and the local count. The free society the Stedingers had built over a century disappeared, and the people who survived were forced back into the feudal system they had resisted for 30 years. Tier 2. The destruction of Aztec and Inca civilizations. Imagine you're a soldier standing on the deck of a ship off the coast of the Americas in the early 1500s. Before anyone goes ashore, an officer reads a document out loud in Spanish. It announces that the people living on that land must accept the authority of the Catholic Church and the Spanish crown immediately. If they refused, war against them is justified. The document was called Requerimiento. The Spanish crown introduced it in 1513 as a legal formality for conquest. Soldiers were supposed to read it to indigenous communities before attacking. The problem was obvious. The people hearing it usually spoke completely different languages and had no idea what was being said. Once the words were read, the Spanish could claim the locals had been given a chance to submit peacefully. If they didn't respond, everything that followed could be framed as legitimate. What followed was one of the largest population collapses in recorded history. Before Spanish contact, central Mexico likely had between 12 and 25 million people. By 1620, fewer than 1.2 million remained. The Inca Empire faced a similar collapse. The civilization stretched across western South America and once held somewhere between 4 and 14 million people. By 1571, fewer than 1.5 million were left. Disease caused much of the death, especially smallpox, measles, and typhus. But forced labor systems, deliberate massacres, and the destruction of existing food networks made the disaster far worse. Many of these actions were carried out under the justification of spreading Christianity. In October 1519, the conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived at Cholula, a major religious city with more than 30,000 residents and over 1,000 temples. Cortés invited around 100 of the city's leaders into a courtyard, then ordered Spanish troops and thousands of allied fighters to attack. One chronicler recorded that about 6,000 people were killed in less than 2 hours. The following year, another officer, Pedro de Alvarado, carried out a similar massacre in the Aztec capital. Hundreds of Mexican nobles had gathered for a religious festival inside the main temple complex. They were unarmed and dressed in ceremonial clothing. Alvarado blocked the exits and ordered his men to attack. While the military destroyed cities, church officials were dismantling indigenous religions. The first bishop of Mexico, Juan de Zumarraga, reported tearing down more than 500 temples and destroying over 20,000 religious images in a single year. In the Yucatan, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa organized a massive book burning in 1562. He destroyed at least 27 Maya books along with thousands of religious objects and oversaw torture meant to force confessions of idolatry. Ironically, Landa's later writings became one of the main surviving sources about Maya culture. Historians often point out that he preserved a small portion of knowledge while destroying vastly more. Out of the countless books written across centuries of Maya civilization, only 4 survive today. Even in Spain, some people questioned whether the conquest could be justified. In 1550, Charles V ordered a debate in Valladolid. One scholar argued indigenous people were natural slaves who needed to be civilized. Another insisted they were fully human societies that deserved the same rights as Europeans. The judges never reached a final decision. The conquest resumed a few years later, and the destruction continued. The Amalekite Genocide. It's around the 11th century BC. Saul is standing in front of an army of 210,000 men, ready to go to war. Then Samuel, the prophet who crowned him king, arrives with a message from God. Samuel tells Saul to wipe out the Amalekites. Men, women, children, babies, and even the animals. Every single one. Letting even one survive would be disobeying God. This story comes from 1 Samuel, chapter 15. Samuel isn't speaking for himself, he speaks as the direct voice of God, so his command carries absolute weight. The order has a long history. Centuries earlier, the Israelites had just escaped slavery in Egypt. They were walking through the desert, exhausted, with no real army. And then, the Amalekites attacked them. But they didn't go after the able-bodied men at the front line. Instead, they went for the weakest people at the back of the group and killed the sick, the tired, and the elderly who couldn't keep up. Because of that ambush, the Bible says God declared a long war against the Amalekites. He told the Israelites to remember what had happened, and that one day, after they had settled in their own land, they would finish the job. But settling in Canaan didn't make the problems go away. The Amalekites kept showing up, raiding farms and towns over and over. The book of Judges mentions them striking repeatedly, sometimes joining forces with other enemies, keeping the threat alive for generations. By the time Saul became king, hundreds of years after the original attack, the Amalekites were still causing trouble. According to the Bible, Saul's mission was meant to be the final punishment. He led his army and crushed the Amalekites. But he didn't finish the job. He let their king, Agag, live. and he allowed his soldiers to keep the best sheep and cattle instead of destroying everything like he was told. When Samuel showed up to check, Saul greeted him like everything was fine. He claimed he had done exactly what God commanded. Samuel wasn't buying it. He could literally hear the animals in the background, so he asked a simple question. If Saul had obeyed completely, why were there still sheep? Saul tried to cover himself, saying the soldiers kept the animals to sacrifice them to God. Samuel shut that down immediately. He told Saul that God doesn't want sacrifices. He wants obedience. And what Saul did, picking and choosing which parts of the command to follow, was the same as flat-out disobeying. Because of this, Samuel told Saul that God was taking the kingdom away from him. Then Samuel did something himself. He ordered Agag, the Amalekite king, to be brought forward. Agag walked in thinking the worst was over. He thought he'd been spared, but Samuel looked at him and said that just as Agag's sword had left mothers without their children, now his own mother would lose her son. And right there, in front of everyone, Samuel hacked Agag to pieces. After all this, God told Samuel that he regretted making Saul king. Samuel was sent to find a replacement. That replacement ended up being David. And from that point on, Saul's story was basically a slow downfall, while David's rises. Jephthah's daughter. Imagine you just won a war. You're alive, walking home, and the enemy is crushed. But instead of celebrating, you're terrified. Because before the battle, you made a promise to God. And now, that promise is going to cost you your family. That's the story in Judges, chapter 11. To understand how it got this bad, you need to know the man behind it. His name was Jephthah. He was born from ancient Israel, and he had a rough life. He had a father, but his mother was a night worker. Because of that, his brothers from different mothers rejected him and kicked him out of the family. He ended up leading a band of raiders in a place called Tuam. But when Israel needed a commander to fight their enemy, the same people who had thrown him out came begging for his help, and he agreed. Before that battle, Jephthah made a vow to God. He said that if God gave him victory, he would make a sacrifice by burning the first thing that came out of his house to greet him when he got home. But according to the text, the Spirit of the Lord had already come upon Jephthah before he made the vow. In other words, he didn't need the promise to win. The power was already there. He made it anyway. And sure enough, he won. His army wiped out enemies across 20 towns, and the war was over. So now, when Jephthah is walking back home, he should be the happiest man alive. But he knows what he promised. And the closer he gets to his house, the heavier that promise starts to feel. Then the door opens, and the first person to come running out is his daughter, his only child. She's dancing, playing tambourines, and celebrating his return, completely unaware of the vow hanging over her. The second Jephthah sees her, he tears his clothes. He screams that she has brought him to ruin because he made a vow to God and he can't take it back. Instead of freaking out like just about anyone else would, Jephthah's daughter did the opposite. She told him that since God gave him the victory, he has to keep his word. All she asked for was 2 months to go up into the mountains with her friends and grieve the fact that she would never get married, never have children, and that her father's family line would die with her. After those 2 months, she came back, and the Bible says Jephthah did to her what he had vowed. The text doesn't go into detail about what happened next, but we already know what the vow was. Now, some people have argued that maybe she wasn't actually killed. Maybe she was given a lifelong service at a holy site and just stayed unmarried forever. But in the original Hebrew text, the word Jephthah used for the sacrifice is olah, and that word is very specific. Every other time it shows up in the Bible, it means something that is killed and completely burned on an altar. At the very end of the chapter, the Bible mentions that it became a tradition in Israel for young women to go away for 4 days every year to mourn Jephthah's daughter. And that's where the Bible leaves it. Tier 3. The Cages of St. Lambert. If you visit the city of Munster in Germany today, you can walk up to St. Lambert's church and look at the tall tower above the square. Hanging near the top are 3 rusty iron cages. At first, they look like creepy decorations for tourists, but they aren't decorations. Those cages once held the bodies of 3 leaders from one of the strangest religious revolts in European history. In 1534, a group of radical Christians called the Anabaptists took control of Munster. They believed God was about to destroy the world, and that this city would be the new holy capital, the new Jerusalem, if you will. They banned private property, forced people to be baptized again as adults, and allowed polygamy. The man in charge, John of Leyden, called himself king and ruled like a prophet. He wore royal robes, made coins with his name on them, and claimed to speak for God. He even took 16 wives for himself. Not everyone accepted what the Anabaptists were doing. The city's original ruler, A Catholic bishop named Franz von Waldeck had been forced out when the rebellion started, but he didn't stay away for long. In early 1534, he raised an army and surrounded Munster, cutting off all food, supplies, and any chance of escape. At first, the people inside Munster held on. They had food stored up, and John of Leyden kept telling them God would save them. But weeks turned into months, and life inside the city kept getting worse. Supplies slowly disappeared, and people started eating whatever they could find. First, the animals were gone. Then, people boiled leather from shoes and belts. And eventually, they were left scraping together anything that might keep them alive. The Anabaptist leaders held on to power by executing anyone who questioned them, so most people kept their heads down and suffered in silence. By the time the siege had dragged on for more than a year, the city was barely hanging on. And then it finally broke. In June 1535, after about 16 months under siege, someone inside Munster betrayed the Anabaptists and helped the bishop's troops get through the walls. Once the soldiers were inside, the whole system collapsed almost immediately. The Anabaptist kingdom fell, and the bishop's army captured John, the self-declared king, along with 2 of his top officials. You'd think that's where the story ends, but nope. The bishop had no interest in ending things quietly. He wanted the entire region to remember what happened to these 3 men for a very long time. So the 3 of them sat in prison for about 7 months. Then, on January 22, 1536, almost 2 years after they seized power, soldiers dragged them out into the city's main square, where a huge crowd had already gathered to watch. The soldiers tied each man to a wooden stake, heated metal tongs until they glowed red, and spent over an hour slowly tearing flesh from their bodies, section by section. They used the same tongs to rip out their tongues, and only once that was done did the executioners drive heated daggers through each man's heart. Even after they were dead, the punishment didn't stop. The authorities stuffed the bodies into iron cages and hung them high on the tower of St. Lambert's church, right over the marketplace so everyone below could see. The corpses rotted there for decades until only bones remained. About 50 years later, the remains were finally buried, but the cages were never removed. The Cadaver Synod. It's January 897, and Rome is buried in the middle of a freezing winter. You walk into the Basilica of St. John Lateran, expecting a sermon. Instead, you see a trial happening, and the accused is sitting on a throne at the front of the room, dressed in full papal robes. But the man on that throne isn't alive. He's been dead for 9 months. This is the Cadaver Synod, basically a church trial where the accused was a corpse. And it's one of the most bizarre and grim episodes in church history. To understand how it happened, you need a bit of context. Back then, the Pope wasn't just a religious leader. He wielded real political power. He could crown emperors, control land, and hand out influence across Europe. Powerful families in Italy were constantly scheming to get their candidate onto the papal throne. One of those families was the House of Spoleto. In 891, a man named Formosus became Pope. At first, he worked with the Spoletans, even crowning their leader Lambert as co-ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. But Formosus got nervous about how aggressive they were getting, so he made a risky move. He invited a rival king, Arnulf of Carinthia, to invade Italy and take the crown instead. Arnulf marched into Rome in 896, and Formosus crowned him as the new emperor. The Spoletans were furious, but Formosus died later that year before they could take revenge. After 2 short-lived successors, a new pope, Stephen VI, took over. Stephen owed everything to the Spoleto family. Lambert, the previously dethroned emperor, had returned to Rome with his forces, and Stephen needed to prove his loyalty. The Spoletans wanted revenge, and they wanted every decision Formosus ever made erased. Stephen was eager to help. So in January 897, he ordered Formosus's body be dug up and brought into the Basilica of St. John Lateran for a formal trial. The corpse was dressed in full papal robes and propped on a throne. A terrified teenage deacon stood next to him, tasked with answering the charges on Formosus's behalf. Stephen shouted accusations, perjury, illegally becoming pope, and breaking rules about bishops holding multiple offices, all claims that had already been settled years earlier. In the stinking, rotting room with an earthquake shaking the basilica mid-trial, Formosus was found guilty. Stephen had his papal robes ripped off, 3 fingers off his right hand, the ones used for blessings, cut off, and the body buried in an unmarked grave. A few days later, Stephen changed his mind. He had the body dug up again, and this time they dumped it into the Tiber River. In ancient Rome, the Tiber was where they threw the bodies of the worst criminals. So by tossing Formosus there, Stephen was sending a clear message. This man deserved to be forgotten. But the plan completely backfired. The public response was full of disgust and anger. Protests broke out in Rome, and not long after, Stephen was overthrown, imprisoned, and strangled to death in his cell. His death came just months after the trial he had forced on a corpse. After the chaos settled, Formosus' body was recovered from the river and brought back to St. Peter's Basilica. Later that same year, Pope Theodore II gave the body a proper burial with full papal honors. Then in 898, Pope John IX officially canceled everything that happened at the Cadaver Synod and made it illegal to put corpses on trial. The Béziers Massacre. It's July 1209, and you live in Béziers, in southern France. A massive army has your town surrounded, and their commander is demanding that you hand over about 200 neighbors labeled as heretics by the Catholic Church. These aren't strangers. These are people you grew up with, families you buy bread from, kids who play with yours. The townspeople refuse, saying they'd rather drown than betray them. So the army decides to take the whole city instead. The people the church wanted were called the Cathars. They were a Christian group based in southern France who believed things the Catholic Church disagreed with. For example, they rejected the Pope's authority and believed the material world was corrupt. Over time, the Cathars had grown popular enough that even local nobles were protecting them, and that made the Pope nervous. So in 1209, Pope Innocent III launched a full military crusade against them right there in France. Béziers was the first city in the way. When the Crusader army finally got inside, they faced a problem. How were they supposed to tell Cathars from ordinary Catholics? Abbot Arnold Amalric, the Pope's representative, had a simple solution. Kill everyone. God would sort out the innocent. On July 22, about 3 weeks after the siege began, the city fell. One of the defenders accidentally left a gate open, and the Crusaders poured in. After that, there was no stopping them. Soldiers slaughtered anyone they found. In the streets, in their homes, everywhere. A lot of residents ran into the Church of St. Mary Magdalene because they figured the soldiers would at least respect the church. But that wasn't the case. The soldiers broke the doors down and killed everyone inside, including the priests. After the massacre, Amalric wrote a letter to the Pope bragging that nearly 20,000 people had died. Most historians think that number is way too high, since the entire population of Béziers was probably smaller than that. But Amalric was not trying to be accurate. He was trying to impress. After the massacre, towns across the region heard what happened in Béziers and surrendered without a fight rather than face the same outcome. The war dragged on for another 20 years, and other cities suffered as well. But Béziers was the moment that defined the whole crusade. Today, Béziers is a normal modern city, but the phrase, "kill them all, God will know his own," is still attached to its name. The Tuam mother and baby home. In 1975, two boys were playing near a patch of land in Western Ireland. While exploring, they pulled up a slab of concrete covering part of the ground. When they looked inside, they found bones. Small human skeletons packed into a hidden tank underground. The adults assumed it was just an old burial, maybe from the Irish famine in the 1800s. No one bothered to investigate. They just sealed the hole, set up a small shrine over it, and went about their lives. For decades, nobody thought about it again. This place used to be the Tuam mother and baby home. It was run by an order of Catholic nuns called the Bon Secours Sisters, and it operated from 1925 to 1961. Girls and women who became pregnant outside of marriage were sent here. At the time, that kind of pregnancy was treated like a crime against God and the community. So the women got hidden away, and the nuns took their babies from them once they were born. Some babies got adopted, but many just stayed there, with no family, no future, and no one making sure they were okay. A lot didn't make it. Diseases like measles and pneumonia tore through them, and others simply stopped growing from lack of food. In some years, more than 30% of the children died, and when they did, there was no proper burial. The nuns just dumped the bodies into an old sewage tank underground. The truth about their actions stayed hidden until 2014, when a local historian, Catherine Corliss, started digging through old death records. She counted 796 children who had died at the Tuam home, but only 2 of them had official burial records. Almost 800 kids had vanished on paper, with no trace of where they ended up. Corliss connected those numbers to the tank 2 boys had found back in 1975. And that's when it all started to make sense. This case sparked so much public outrage that the government couldn't ignore it. In 2017, about 3 years after Corliss published her findings, investigators dug up part of the site. What they found matched the records. The government issued a formal apology in 2021. The religious group that ran the home eventually apologized. They said they were sorry the children had been buried in what they called a disrespectful way. Now, the plan is to recover the remains, give them a proper burial, and turn the site into a memorial. The Children's Crusade. In 1212, tens of thousands of children left their homes in Europe and never came back. They had no maps, no food, no weapons, and were walking thousands of miles to Jerusalem to fight a war they didn't understand. Why? Because the adults had failed. After years of knights losing battles in the Holy Land, people started saying God was tired of soldiers. Innocence, they claimed, would succeed where armies had failed. Of course, that wasn't the case at all. The mission wasn't officially organized by the church or the Pope. Instead, it spread through word of mouth. Preachers and young leaders told children that God would fight for them. In France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed Jesus had given him a mission. Tens of thousands followed him, convinced their innocence would carry them to victory. Stephen led them toward Paris, expecting the king to back their Holy Crusade. Instead, King Philip II saw nothing but a disorderly crowd with no food, no plan, and no chance for survival. He ordered them to disperse. The group fell apart immediately. Some children returned home, but others wandered alone, unprotected, starving, or lost forever. At the same time, in Germany, another boy, Nicholas of Cologne, inspired a similar movement. His followers marched south, singing hymns and begging for food. Nicholas promised the Mediterranean Sea would part for them. Exhausted, starving, and shrinking in number, they reached Genoa, only to find the sea did not obey. Some children gave up and stayed in Italy. Others followed Nicholas to Rome, where the Pope sent them home. But not all made it back. A few hundred ended up in Marseille, where merchants offered free passage to the Holy Land. 2 ships sank in storms. The others sailed to North Africa and were sold into slavery. Most of them died from hunger, cold, drowning, or at the hands of other people. Chroniclers later said God clearly wasn't on their side. Tier 4. The Circumcellions. Imagine walking down a dusty road in North Africa during the 4th century, minding your own business, when you see a group of guys in black robes heading your way. They look like monks, so you expect them to pass quietly. Instead, they start shouting, "Praise the Lord," and smash your knees with a giant wooden club. You're confused. You didn't do anything to them, but that's the point. They're beating you because they want you to fight back and kill them. It might be the most aggressive way anyone has ever asked for a favor. These attackers were called the Circumcellions, and they were carried out by a radical group of Christians who believed the surest path to heaven was dying for God. The problem was that Christianity had just been legalized in the Roman Empire, which meant believers were no longer being hunted down and executed. Without persecution, there was no easy way to become a martyr, the religious term for someone who dies for their faith. So the Circumcellions came up with their own solution. If the authorities wouldn't kill them, they would provoke random travelers into doing it instead. They roamed the countryside, carrying massive wooden clubs they nicknamed Israels to beat people up. They used heavy sticks because the Bible says not to use swords. So they figured causing blunt force trauma with a log was a holy loophole that God wouldn't mind. They would ambush soldiers and judges on the road, hoping to make the victims angry enough to strike back and kill them right there. When their plan didn't work because people ran away, the Circumcellions would get frustrated and just throw themselves off cliffs or burn themselves alive in big groups. They also started attacking wealthy landlords to cancel debts, acting like violent hobos who felt entitled to your money and were hoping you'd return the favor by killing them. The main church leaders like St. Augustine hated them and said they were acting like they were possessed by demons. Eventually, the Romans got tired of the noise and wiped them out, which means the Circumcellions finally got the bloody death they wanted. It shows that if you beg for trouble long enough, eventually someone will be happy to give it to you. The Skoptsy. Imagine sitting in a dim basement in 18th century Russia, listening to a preacher talk about how hard it is to live a pure life. The room is full of people dressed in white, who look calm and devout. Then, without warning, the leader places a metal iron in the fire and tells you to drop your pants. At first, you might think it's some kind of strange joke, but everyone in the room is completely serious. They belong to a secret religious sect called the Skoptsy. The group took the story of Adam and Eve way too literally. They believe that when the first humans ate the forbidden fruit, the fruit didn't just disappear. It attached itself to their bodies and eventually became human organs. To the Skoptsy, those parts of the bodies were physical reminders of humanity's fall from grace. Their solution was drastic. Members went through a ritual they called the seal, meant to remove the source of lust and restore the purity of angels. Men had their testicles or sometimes the entire package cut off, while women had their breasts and other private parts removed. In the early days, they used red-hot irons, believing the fire purified the soul along with the flesh. Later, they switched to knives and razors. And while most people would be screaming in agony, Skoptsy initiates were expected to shout, "Christ is risen," as the ritual was carried out. The group was led by a guy named Selivanov, who had a massive ego, and claimed he was actually Jesus and a dead Russian emperor named Peter III at the same time. He was so convincing that the cult spread from poor farmers all the way to rich nobles in the big cities, who wanted to be God's lambs. There were even dark rumors that members kidnapped children and forced them to get the surgery, because they needed exactly 144,000 members to trigger the end of the world. The Russian government tried to stop them for years, but the group only really disappeared when the Soviets took over and crushed them. The Adamites. In the year 1421, a Czech army surrounded an island to wipe out a dangerous enemy. They expected a normal battle, but when the attack started, they realized the enemy fighters were not wearing any armor. In fact, they weren't wearing anything at all. These people were called the Adamites. They were a radical Christian group that wanted to live exactly like Adam and Eve before they committed the first sin. They believed that clothes were a sign of shame, so the only way to be pure again was to strip naked and act like the rules of society didn't exist anymore. That might sound like a weird but harmless lifestyle, except they also believed that since they were innocent, nothing they did could count as sin. They set up their own fake Garden of Eden on an island in the Nazarka River. From there, they started building a new way of life. They decided that private property and marriage were evil inventions created by humans. Instead, they practiced what they called free love, swapping partners whenever they wanted during wild parties around the bonfire. They believed they were living as holy angels on earth. Because of that, they felt justified in robbing nearby villages for supplies, convinced that God wouldn't hold it against them. The surrounding villages obviously disagreed. A general named John Ziska decided to wipe them out for being disgusting and dangerous. When his army attacked the island in 1421, the Adamites didn't put on armor or try to hide. Instead, they rushed into battle completely naked and singing hymns while getting cut down by professional soldiers. It is very hard to win a sword fight when your only protection is your birthday suit. Most were killed instantly, and the few who survived were burned at the stake. After the battle, the movement was mostly destroyed, but the idea kept popping up years later in other places. In the 1530s, a group in the Netherlands started getting baptized while naked to symbolize their freedom from sin. It all came to a head in 1535 when a group of these guys sprinted through the streets of Amsterdam completely nude, screaming "Woe to the world" at confused pedestrians. The authorities caught them, and their leaders were executed. Some were killed by sword, and others were burned alive. The Convulsionnaires of Saint-Médard. Between 1730 and 1732, thousands of people in Paris gathered in a graveyard to watch women get smashed with heavy sledgehammers. The women were resisting. They were begging for it, convinced the pain was a gift from God. They called themselves the Convulsionnaires of Saint-Médard. For them, worship meant suffering in public, and the graveyard became their stage. These people were followers of a strict Catholic group called Jansenists, who believed that a dead deacon named François de Paris could heal them. At first, the pilgrims just had strange shaking fits at his tomb, which they thought were signs of God's favor. It seemed like a weird trend until the Shakers decided that the only way to cure their convulsions was to experience extreme physical pain. They called this relief, or secours in French, and it quickly turned into a twisted game where they begged people to beat them up. The situation escalated from simple slaps to full-blown violence that they called murderous relief, or grand secours. Young women would lay on the ground half naked, while other members stomped on their stomachs, hit them with sledgehammers, or poked them with swords. Some of the most extreme members even had themselves crucified on wooden crosses right there in the cemetery, while crowds paid money to sit in rented chairs and watch. The women claimed they felt pleasure instead of pain. They insisted that God protected their skin from getting bruised or cut. When he caught wind of it, the King of France was so creeped out by these half-naked torture parties that he locked the cemetery gates. In response, an unidentified individual hung a sign in the gate mocking the king. It said, "By order of the king, God is forbidden to perform miracles in this place." They didn't stop, though. They just shifted into private basements, carrying on the beatings in secret, and it went on like that for years. Tier 5. The Borborites. You're visiting a friend in Egypt during the 4th century, and they invite you to a secret underground church service. You expect to hear some boring sermons and maybe eat some dry bread for communion. But then you notice the bread is actually a handful of white sticky fluid. You realize too late that you have walked into a meeting of the Borborites, and they are about to serve you a dinner that would make a goat vomit. These people were a radical group that other Christians called the Muddy Ones, because their habits were so incredibly filthy. They believed that God's light was trapped inside human bodies, and the only way to free it was through very specific physical acts that would get you arrested in a public park today. They believed that the male seed and female menstrual blood actually held the divine spark of life. So they collected these fluids during wild parties and ate them as a holy sacrament. Men would perform acts on themselves or each other to collect the body of Christ on their hands, while women provided the blood during their monthly cycles. As twisted as it sounds, they genuinely believed this was a sacred ritual. They even called it communion. It got significantly nastier if a woman actually got pregnant during these services, because they hated the idea of birth. They believed bringing babies into the world was a sin that trapped souls in human bodies. So instead of letting pregnancies reach term, they would perform abortions and turn the fetuses into meals. They would chop them up, mix the pieces with honey and spices to hide the taste, and eat it together as the perfect Passover. The main guy who wrote about the Borborites was a bishop named Epiphanius, who really hated them. So he might have been exaggerating to make them look bad. He claimed that 2 women from the sect tried to recruit him personally, and that he only escaped by reporting them to the local bishop, who then kicked them out of the city. The church then spent years hunting the group down to stop their practices. To this day, no one has been able to determine if Epiphanius was telling the full truth or just crafting one of the most extreme smear campaigns in Christian history. The Castrati. Every year during the 1700s, parents across Italy would take thousands of little boys to the doctor, not to fix a broken leg or cure a fever. They were there to pay a surgeon to cut off their son's manhood. The tradition was called the Castrati, and the goal was simple: to permanently mutilate these boys so their voices would stay high-pitched, all to entertain the Pope and the church elite. For hundreds of years, the Catholic Church had a strict rule that women were not allowed to sing during church services because they had to be silent. The problem was that the fancy choir music required high-pitched voices that adult males simply could not reach. So the solution was to take young boys and remove their testicles before they hit puberty. This stopped their hormones from working, so their voices never dropped. This surgery created a strange physical combination. The singer grew the giant lungs of a large man, but he kept the tiny vocal cords of a child. It resulted in a ghostly, powerful sound that people called the voice of an angel, even though it required doing something demonic to get it. The church was incredibly hypocritical about the whole thing. They officially said that castration was a sin, and you could get kicked out of the religion for doing it. However, the popes loved the music so much that they hired these guys constantly. They just pretended the boys had lost their parts in accidents, like falling off a horse or getting bit by a wild pig. The sad part is that poor parents actually wanted this. They would sell their children to these surgeons, hoping the boy would become the next Farinelli. He was a superstar castrato who was as famous and rich as a king. But it was a gamble with terrible odds. Most boys did not turn out to be superstars. If the boy grew up and his voice was just average, he was totally ruined. He could not have a family, he looked too weird to do manual labor, and society mocked him for being a freak. Thousands of these boys ended up living in poverty as lonely outcasts, having lost their manhood for a fame that never arrived. The madness did not officially stop until 1902, when the Pope finally banned them from the Sistine Chapel. The very last one was a man named Alessandro Moreschi. He actually made audio recordings that you can still listen to today. When you hear his voice, you are listening to the last echo of a system that sacrificed children just to make the choir sound a little bit prettier. The Holy Prepuce. If you go to the town of Calcutta in Italy today, you can walk through the streets of a beautiful village sitting on a high rock. For hundreds of years, thousands of people flooded into this town every January to see a tiny gold box. Inside that box was a piece of skin that shouldn't exist. It was said to be the only part of Jesus that stayed on earth when he went to heaven. This object was known as the Holy Prepuce, and it became the most controversial treasure in the Catholic world. Since Jesus was Jewish, he was circumcised as a baby, and medieval Christians became obsessed with finding that missing piece of skin. Yes, the object in question is a foreskin. They figured it was worth more than gold. The trend started when Emperor Charlemagne gave one to the Pope, claiming an angel gave it to him, which is a great story if you want to avoid explaining where you actually found a piece of that specific skin part. The problem was that everybody wanted one, so suddenly churches all over Europe claimed they had the real thing. At one point, there were up to 18 different churches arguing that their piece of skin was the authentic one. Critics pointed out that unless Jesus had a very strange medical condition, at least 17 of those churches were lying. The whole thing eventually turned into a bizarre competition where towns would brag about their relic just to get more tourists and money. Things got even weirder when nuns like St. Catherine of Siena started having visions about it. She claimed that Jesus married her in a spiritual ceremony and gave her a wedding ring made entirely out of his own foreskin. Foreskin that, according to her, only she could see. It gets worse from there. There were records of priests and experts performing a taste test to check on these relics. They would travel from church to church, and at each stop, they would actually taste the skin to see if it secreted a sweet, holy flavor. It's probably the worst job description in the history of the Catholic Church. The church eventually got embarrassed by all the foreskin madness and threatened to excommunicate anyone who talked about it again. The last famous one was kept in that same Italian village called Calcutta until 1983, when thieves stole it under mysterious circumstances. Some people think the Vatican had it stolen just to make the awkward questions stop, but we'll never know for sure. The corpse of St. Catherine of Siena. Imagine you're the guard at the gates of Rome in the 1300s, checking travelers for stolen goods. A nervous group from Siena comes forward, carrying a sack that smells like a perfume shop. You peek inside and see nothing but thousands of fresh rose petals, so you shrug and wave them through. What you don't realize is that hidden beneath those petals is a severed human head. You just let a gang of holy grave robbers get away with exactly what they were after. The head belonged to St. Catherine of Siena, the saint that claimed Jesus married her in a spiritual ceremony. Apparently, that claim made her a super famous holy woman that everybody wanted a piece of after she died at age 33. The problem was that she died in Rome, but the people from her hometown of Siena were extremely jealous and wanted her body back. They knew they couldn't drag a whole corpse out of the city without getting caught by the police, so they made a very practical, gruesome decision to just chop off her head and take that instead. They also grabbed one of her thumbs for good measure, because if you're already robbing a grave, you might as well grab a souvenir for the road. The thieves stuffed her head into a bag and covered it with rose petals to hide the smell of death. When the guards stopped them, a miracle supposedly happened where the head looked like flowers to fool the soldiers. Once they got back to safety in Siena, the petals turned back into a head. The miracle convinced the thieves that St. Catherine actually wanted to be moved back to her birthplace. Today, you can still visit the Basilica of San Domenico in Siena and see the actual mummified head sitting inside a glass box on an altar. It doesn't look like a sleeping beauty anymore, but it is still valuable to the people there. Her thumb is also in a box nearby. The rest of her body remains under the high altar in Rome, except for a foot that somehow ended up in Venice, and a hand in another Roman monastery. It was common back then to chop up saints like they were trading cards, so every city could have a piece of the magic. This story shows that medieval people loved their saints so much, they were willing to tear them apart just to show their affection. It is a level of obsession that makes modern celebrity stalkers look healthy. After looking at all these dark stories, it's clear that people can use faith to justify almost anything. Makes you wonder what else is still hidden in the shadows. If you enjoy this iceberg, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange and disturbing. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.